It's really disturbing the level at which some people will go to achieve their own personal gratification, having complete disregard for human life, viewing everyone around them like tools or obstacles in order to reach their twisted goals. I'm your host, James, and today I'm bringing you the top 10 evil prisoners the FBI are hiding from you. And we're starting off with Eric Rudolph. Eric Rudolph is known for his involvement in a series of bombings in the United States during the 1990s. These acts, violence which targeted innocent civilians, were carried out due to his twisted political agenda. He was setting out to purify a world he believed was sinful, wanting to get rid of those he felt were undeserving of God's love. His most notorious attack was the bombing at the 1996 Summer Olympics in Atlanta, where he planted an explosive that killed one person and injured over 100 others. In addition to the Olympic attack, Rudolph was responsible for a string of attacks at clinics and lesbian nightclub. He was motivated by pure hatred, just wanting to further his agenda through violence. And what makes Rudolph's case even more disturbing is the fact that he managed to evade capture for years, fueling this ongoing anxiety and fear in the communities he targeted. He was finally arrested in 2003, though, now serving 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Next up, we have Dennis Rader. This guy is just pure evil, plain and simple. He'd call himself BTK. As for what that stands for, just Google it. Pretty messed up that someone would be proud to refer to themselves that way. He committed a series of heinous crimes over several decades in Wichita, Kansas. Rader's deeds, which included the brutal unalivings of innocent people, just showed a complete disregard for human life. And what makes his case even more disturbing was his ability to blend into society as this seemingly average, unsuspecting neighbor and family man. He was a church leader, a facade which allowed him to gain the trust of his victims. And this is like part of why when people make claims after someone does something really terrible, like, oh, he never could have done something like that. He was so normal, he was so upstanding, so blah, blah, blah. Evil comes in many forms and wears many different masks. That's why it's so insidious. Now, Rader's obsession with power and control over others led to him to commit unspeakable acts, but his evil extended beyond the physical harm he inflicted. He also taunted law enforcement and the public through these chilling letters and messages, just reveling in the fear and torment he was creating. Number 8, Charles Cullen. So this guy was a nurse, and he's on this list. So this is one of those creepy cases where someone working in the medical field is secretly harming their patients. People have put their complete trust and faith in them. Really sickening. Over the course of his nursing career, he administered lethal doses of medications to patients under his care, ultimately causing the deaths of an estimated 40 or more patients, possibly even in the hundreds. His crimes spanned across multiple hospitals, making it tough for authorities to initially identify the extent of his actions. And as for his motivations, they remain somewhat murky, but it is clear that he derived some form of satisfaction from exerting control over life and death within this hospital setting. Families were left devastated, and fellow hospital staff were confused and began to become suspicious of the sudden and unexpected deaths of these patients. And ultimately, Cullen's spree ended when he was arrested in 2003. He's now serving 11 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole until 2403. The American justice system is really weird. Like, just say he's never getting out. Next up, we have David Berkowitz. David Berkowitz, infamously known as the Son of Sam, committed a string of brutal crimes in the mid-70s that terrorized New York City. He was responsible for a series of shootings that left 6 people dead and several others injured. Berkowitz's actions were driven by a twisted compulsion that led him to randomly target innocent victims, mostly young couples in parked cars. What makes Berkowitz's crimes particularly chilling and very bizarre is his claim that he was following the orders of his neighbor's dog, which he believed was possessed by a demon. I think he was pinning the whole demon possession thing and on the wrong place. I was going to say on the wrong person, but a dog, not really a person. What really made this guy so scary, though, was just how random his attacks were and his ability to elude capture for an extended period, which left New Yorkers living in dread for this possible next attack. Berkowitz was finally apprehended in 1977, and he is currently serving 6 consecutive life sentences, just in case he dies and is reborn again. Number 6, Gary Ridgway. Gary Ridgway, commonly known as the Green River Killer, is a notorious criminal who terrorized the state of Washington during the 80s and 90s. He was responsible for the unalivings of at least 49 women, although he later confessed to taking the lives of even more victims. Ridgway carried out his crimes by targeting vulnerable women, primarily workers of the night and runaways, whom he would lure, often by showing them pictures of his son to gain their trust before violently attacking them and discarding them like trash in remote locations. What makes Ridgway's crimes even more horrifying is the cold-blooded and calculated manner in which he hunted his victims. He often even returned to the dumping grounds, and as to what he did there, not something I can or want to get into here, but suffice to say, this guy belongs exactly where he is now. He managed to evade capture for nearly 2 decades, but was finally apprehended in 2001 through DNA evidence and his own admissions. He struck a plea deal providing information about the location of his victims' remains in exchange for a life sentence, avoiding the death penalty. Next on the list is Kristen Gilbert, another nurse. Over the course of several years, she intentionally administered fatal doses of medication to patients under her care, leading to their premature deaths. She would inject their IV bags with high doses of epinephrine, causing cardiac arrest. Nurses actually noticed a higher than normal amount of deaths with patients in her care, but initially just thought it was a coincidence and would give her the nickname Angel of Death as a joke. It's not uncommon for people working in very intense working environments like hospitals to have a bit of a dark sense of humor in order to cope, but in hindsight, that's pretty morbid. Imagine looking back on that after the fact, having made that joke and being like, oh damn, yeah, that was more accurate than we thought. She was very calculated in her actions, exploiting her position within the hospital. She used her authority to carry out her crimes, all while evading suspicion for a long time. In terms of her motivations for doing what she did, I mean, what possible motive would ever make sense for something like this? Maybe she had a desire for control, power. Doesn't really make a difference anyway. There's not really any motivation that would make any of this forgivable, let alone okay. Gilbert was eventually caught when coworkers started catching on to her, prompting an investigation that led to her arrest. And at number 4 is Wayne Williams. Born on May 27, 1958 in Atlanta, Williams grew up with an interest in radio and journalism. But his supposed connection to the Atlanta unaliving, specifically the homicides of 29 young people, both male and female, are what he's most well known for. Between 1979 and 81, a series of disappearances and discoveries of bodies in rivers and wooded areas shocked the Atlanta community. These victims displayed signs of strangulation or asphyxiation. In 1981, Wayne Williams came under police scrutiny when he was stopped on a bridge above the Chattahoochee River. During this encounter, investigators found fibers in his vehicle that were believed to match those discovered on some of the victims, and as a result, Williams was arrested and charged with the deaths of 2 adults, Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Payne. In 1982, Williams faced trial and received 2 life sentences. Law enforcement were adamant that by apprehending Williams, they had also solved many of the cases involving the young people, even though he could only solely be tied to the 2 adult victims, and there was no real evidence to support his involvement in those other cases. His sentencing is still controversial to this day, as Williams claimed the KKK had actually been responsible. All of these victims, the 2 adults and the missing young people, had been African American, and Williams believed the true circumstances of the case had been covered up by authorities. Next up, we have Joseph DeAngelo Jr. DeAngelo Jr., a former police officer, gained infamy as the Golden State Killer, born on November 8, 1945 in Bath, New York. He would go on to commit a series of horrifying crimes that terrorized California communities from 1974 to 1986. His spree included burglaries, SA, and murders. He would often break into homes, tying up and terrorizing his victims before committing these acts. Over the years, his crimes remained unsolved. It was only in 2018 that he was finally arrested and identified through DNA evidence. In June of 2020, Joseph DeAngelo pleaded guilty to numerous charges. On August 21st, 2020, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never be released to harm others again. Number 2, Robert Hansen. Born on February 15th, 1939 in Estherville, Iowa, he operated in Anchorage, Alaska during the 70s and early 80s. Hansen's crimes primarily targeted young women. His method involved luring his victims with promises of money or employment. Then he would abduct and transport them to a remote wilderness area, and there, things would play out like a real-life horror movie. He would release them and then hunt them down like animals, subjecting them to unspeakable acts of violence. He is known to have taken the lives of at least 17 women, although the true number of his victims may be much higher. His crimes went undetected for years due to his careful planning and knowledge of the Alaskan wilderness, but his capture came in 1983 when one of his intended victims actually managed to escape. This led to a search of Hansen's property where evidence, including jewelry belonging to some of the missing women, was discovered. In February of 1984, Robert Hansen was arrested. In a plea agreement, he confessed to his crimes and provided information on the locations of his victims' remains. In return for his cooperation, Hansen received a 461-year prison sentence without the possibility of parole. And finally, we have the Ripper Crew. The Ripper Crew were a group of 4 individuals responsible for a series of gruesome crimes in Chicago during the early 80s. The group consisted of Robert Gett, Edward Spreitzer, Andrew Coco Reales, and Thomas Coco Reales, terrorizing the city with their gruesome acts of violence. Their crimes primarily involved the abduction and unaliving of women. The victims were subjected to unspeakable acts of violence. The group's name, Ripper Crew, was a name they coined themselves, as they would sometimes dismember their victims. It was even said they would consume parts of their body in ritualistic ceremonies. The members of the Ripper Crew were arrested in 1982 and 83 after law enforcement agencies launched an extensive investigation into their activities. Evidence including statements from the perpetrators themselves and the recovery of victims' remains linked them to the crimes. Everyone received proper sentences for the most part, but Thomas Coco Reales was released in 2019, and according to him, he's not a monster, which is incorrect. With all that said though, I've been your host James, and I'll catch you, yes you specifically, in the next video.